You grew more hair since I last spoke with you.
Yeah, you criticized my haircut last time, so I thought I'd fix it for you this time around, so I get less criticism.
I didn't really criticize it. I just found it interesting, Being an older gent, I'm happy to have whatever comes out.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you, sir. I want to start off with the drone incursion we saw in Denmark. It seemed, because we talked last time when there was a drone incursion over Poland. I think afterwards there was one in Romania. Then we saw the incursion of a Russian jet over Finland, I think it was, or Estonia. And now we've got the drone incursion over Denmark. I would love to get your thoughts on all incursions and mainly focusing on today's one.
I have talked with my trusted sources in the intelligence community. There have been no provocative incursions by the Russians at all. The 19 drones that were found on the ground when they crashed or ran out of steam, whatever it was, many of them had Polish and Swedish SIM cards in them. So they may have been Russian at some point, but were ultimately repurposed and then through other means sent into Polish airspace as a false flag. The report from Denmark is very suspicious. Those 3 drones, there is no evidence that they have any connection whatsoever to Russia. None. As far as the aircraft violating Estonian airspace, it flew along what we call the air defense identification zone. There was no intention to violate anything. The Russians have been scrupulously careful not to give people in the West an excuse to start a war. That's bottom line, because the Russians do not want a war with NATO or the United States. So I would forget all of them as false flag attempts or erroneous reports.
So I interviewed Christopher yesterday, and he made a very similar point. He said these look like false flag attacks, especially the timing of them before the UN General Assembly. And the intention there, and the point he was making, I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is to pressure the US to flip their strategy and support Ukraine. Do you agree with that analysis? And how is it feasible? How is intelligence sharing? Like, these are allies, these are all NATO members. Would NATO members lie to each other about such simple things? Would it be able to? Would the Nordic countries be able to lie? Poland be able to lie to the US?
I think there is a conspiracy to lie, to create the illusion that there is a dangerous, offensive Russia that is determined to make war on the West. That's just one enormous lie. And we're reaching a point now where the European publics in particular are concluding that Russia doesn't present the threat as is alleged. And the globalist governments in places like France, Germany, and Great Britain, we're talking about the 3 amigos, Starmer, Macron, and Merz, are on very thin ice right now. They're close to being removed from office. You have genuine revolutionary action brewing, certainly in Britain and France. And I wouldn't rule it out over the long term in Germany. So I think they're quite desperate. Because the worst thing that can happen to them is that everybody finally concludes that they haven't been telling the truth, which is increasingly the case, that they're an oppressed electorate because free speech has been robbed of them. So I think they're going to do whatever they can to try and provoke, prolong, push this Ukrainian war myth that Russia wants to attack the West. It doesn't.
What about the other theory of Russia testing NATO's resolve? Is that a possibility of pressuring NATO to accept some sort of peace deal? Because the more they pressure other NATO countries, then voters would oppose any prolonging of the war.
No, I am unaware of any pressure on NATO to make peace with Russia. The only thing that Russia has ever done is stipulate the conditions under which it's prepared to make peace. And as the prelude to any sort of final security arrangement involving Ukraine. So I'm not aware of any pressure from Russia on the European states to do anything. I'm a little surprised that anybody would say that. I don't know if you could link all of this specifically to the UN General Assembly. I do think that the globalists in Europe are frustrated right now with Donald Trump and his latest statement. And I think we should look at that statement because that really speaks volumes as to where the United States is right now.
Yeah, I'm going to read out that statement. I wanted to ask you one more question about something that happened today, and then we'll go into that statement and the developments over the last few days, as well as that meeting with Zelensky. I know you put out a post on this I was reading earlier. But I want to go to just another piece of news that came out today. And some people are calling fear-mongering about World War III incoming. Others are talking about a military purge by Trump, similar to what we saw early on in the second term. So I'll just read out, you probably saw it online. So Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, ordered hundreds of the U.S. military's generals and admirals together on short notice and without a stated reason in Virginia at a Marine Corps base. The Pentagon spokesman just affirmed that Hegseth will be addressing his senior military leaders early next week. Now, that's apparently very unusual. You've got a few people concerned. I'll put out a quote by one of the sources that said people are very concerned. They have no idea what it means. And another one, a senior Pentagon correspondent with 30 years experience said, I've never seen anything like this. Have you read about this? What are your thoughts as a former colonel?
Well, I can tell you what I know. There are 800 senior officers coming to this meeting. These are overwhelmingly 4 stars and 3 stars. And I think this has something to do with the extraordinarily excess overhead in the United States Armed Forces. I think if you go and look at the ratio of general officers to men, sailors, airmen, Marines, soldiers fighting on the field, certainly during the Second World War, it was 1 to at least 2,000 or 3,000, something in that neighborhood. And during the entire Second World War, at least until the end, when we sort of gave people honorific promotions, you get an extra star, thank you for coming and doing a great job kind of thing. We had only 7 4-stars. Right now, we have roughly 44 stars. During World War II, the size of the force was usually about 12 million. That's 7 4-stars for 12 million. And right now, I think the force is a little over 1 million, 1.1 million, and we have 44 stars. That tells you there's something radically wrong. This bureaucratic overhead has grown to the point of absurdity. So I'm sure something in that connection will be discussed.
Yeah, I'm trying to find those numbers. I was reading that same thing. That's my assumption as well. But is there any, is there any validity to the concerns that there could be something more serious from this meeting beyond just a purge or kind of looking for more efficiency within the Defense Department?
I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know what you would point to at this stage. There may be some discussion about changes in other policies. We have enormous numbers of women in the armed forces right now. That's really a serious problem for us. It's something nearing 15 to 20% of the force. There's a desire to reduce that to about 5%. I've heard that number kicked around, which is probably reasonable. There may be some announcement in connection with affirmative action, which is now really no longer, strictly speaking, legal, since the Supreme Court largely overturned it, but we continue to use it to advance non-white people, women and other non-Europeans. Is he going to talk about that? I don't know. I mean, maybe he'll have something to say about where he thinks we're headed in the future regarding Europe and Asia, because I know there's a desire to reduce our profile, particularly in Asia. We have forces in places where they're frankly not needed, haven't been needed for 2 decades. All of that is possible. So all we can do is speculate, Mario. I don't have any firm information on that.
There's one theory that these drone incursions are reconnaissance drones by Russia. I found that to be unlikely. I'm not sure how useful reconnaissance drones will be over Danish territory, especially now we've got satellite imagery that's pretty advanced. And some people are trying to link those drone incursions that we've seen over the last week to that urgent meeting by Pete Hegseth. I'm guessing by what you said, highly unlikely.
No, I don't think that makes any sense. And remember, we had the U-2 that used to fly these missions routinely over the Soviet Union and other places back in the 1950s. Once we had space-based, reconnaissance, surveillance, intelligence, we no longer needed that. The Russians have it as well. They can find and see virtually everything of importance. The other thing is the Russians have thousands of people on the ground, particularly in Eastern Europe, with cell phones that can call and tell them anything they need to know immediately. I mean, this has been the problem throughout the Ukraine war. Thousands of Russian agents on the ground in Western Ukraine. So I don't think any of that is serious.
I agree. The biggest story and something you covered in your post is the meeting with Zelensky yesterday. Trump put out a post. He said the following: after getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russian military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it is causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. Why not? Massive shift. Now, I do understand Trump's strategy is to always speak a big game. Does not mean that what he's saying is something he genuinely believes that it is realistic. But one cannot deny it is a pretty significant shift in the strategy. What was your initial reaction when you saw this?
Well, two things. First of all, he's now made the transformation from being Donald Trump to Joe Biden #2. That's the first part. Joe Biden never knew what was going on either. I'm not sure President Trump does. He certainly never looked carefully into the war that was ongoing and how it got started and why. I think this is also an abdication on his part of leadership. Here's the President of the United States who is supposed to be leading NATO. And he has said, look, we'll sell you all the equipment you need. Well, first of all, that presumes the Europeans can afford to buy it. That's not exactly clear right now. They've got serious fiscal constraints on them. Secondly, it presumes that we're going to have all of this equipment, particularly missiles, radars, and other things, ready to go at a moment's notice. We're way behind in our production. We're not like Russia. Russia's factories are humming. They have an excess of equipment and capability, frankly, that we don't possess. And then finally, he's saying, I've decided to sit this out. This is your war. You can do what you want with this, and we wish you all the best. Good luck. What? This is the man who claims to be the leader of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, more than 32 members, and he's effectively saying, hey, here it is. Go and do what you think is best, but I'm sitting it out. What kind of a message is that to send to the alliance? Orban spoke recently, Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, and he said, don't bother going to Washington. He was speaking to his fellow European Union members, as well as NATO. He said, don't bother going to Washington. If you want to end this war, you need to go to Moscow. We need to realign ourselves and sort through this. And I think he's right. I mean, if anything, Donald Trump is signaling, well, Europe, you're pretty much on your own. And there's this notion of I'm transactional. I'm Donald Trump. You pay me money. I'll do what you want. I mean, all of this is, from my standpoint, not very flattering to the United States of America or its leadership. So the whole idea that he's dedicated or devoted to ending the war has gone away. If anything, he's saddled up with Joe Biden. Yeah, let's keep this going. Russia's a paper tiger. Russia is an impregnable fortress. The Russian military establishment is better now than it's been in 30, 40 years. It's excellent, and it's broken the code on the future paradigm of warfare. We haven't. We're a long way from all of these things. Europeans are no way they're going to get anywhere. Ukraine, they're herding people in their 50s and 60s, along with women when they can find them, into uniform to go be killed at the front. This is over. This is a disaster. It's a catastrophe. Ukraine as a nation state is destroyed. He should be interested in ending this conflict, recognizing the facts on the ground, which is something he talked about months ago. But, this is Donald Trump, who's just shrugged his shoulders and say, well, okay, I've got other things, so good luck. We'll sell you whatever we want. Now let's turn our attention to Venezuela. All
right. But the reason I found that hard to believe is Zelensky seemed pretty optimistic after his meetings with Trump. He put out a post, I think it was today or yesterday. He said it was a good conversation about the outcomes of this visit to the US, my talks with President Trump, and the important shift in his signals regarding support for Ukraine. And then he said, we discussed many things with the president, foremost political support for Ukraine, strategic support for Ukraine, and future considerations, but also the very important tactical support needed right now to endure. Is it possible that because you initially said that he's become, Joe Biden 2.0, which is increasing support and aid to Ukraine. But then you later on said something that, again, Alex said yesterday, is that he's absolving himself from the fight. He's saying, look, this is Europe's problem. I'm out. And this truth post is more of a hedge if things go sideways and Russia continues advancing. Which one is it? Do you think, or could it be both? Could it be increasing support but also hedging himself?
Yes, I think he's doing both. And this is not unusual for politicians. Politicians want to say everything that's possible to endear themselves to everybody in the room. I don't think Trump is very different. That's why I say this is an abdication of leadership on his part. Instead of recognizing the facts on the ground and saying we've got to sit down and put an end to this, otherwise the Ukrainian state won't survive, he simply walked away and said, here, I'll give you all the stuff that you want. So I think it's both. The unfortunate part is it's not an answer. It does nothing for Ukraine. Now, if you're Zelensky, who already has piled up somewhere between 1.2 and 1.7 billion in cash in various bank accounts from the money that you've been able to steal from everything that's gone into Ukraine, and you're sitting on top of an organized crime state, half the material that we've sent over there ends up being sold on the black market. That's why we watch drug cartel members walking around with Javelin missiles. He's happy. It keeps him in power, so he thinks. The question that's really important now is that what is President Putin going to do? You know, he doesn't expect a great deal to change in terms of the military capability that will show up in Western Ukraine. Does he continue to wait until these European states' leaders are overthrown? In other words, removed from office, and nationalists who actually care about their countries come to power? I mean, that's what he's been doing, in my judgment. Or does he say, listen, let's end this thing. Let's put pedal to the metal. Let's move to the river, take Odessa, and prepare to cross and deal with Kiev. Is that where he's going to go? I don't know. But he has the upper hand militarily on the ground. No question about it.
If you were advising Europe right now, you've seen that post from Trump, potentially increasing support to Ukraine, but also absolving himself from if things go wrong. What would you make of this shift in strategy, and how should they go about ending this war?
Well, I would do what Orban suggests. I would say, particularly if I were Merz in Berlin, since he has the most to lose at this stage if this nonsense continues. I mean, if he delivers Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, substantial parts of Germany could end up being destroyed because the Russians aren't going to put up with that. They're not going to tolerate it. That would be analogous to us tolerating the delivery of dangerous deep strike missile systems to Mexico to be fired into the United States that happen to come from China. At some point, you turn around to China and say that's unacceptable. So protect your coast. We're going to level a couple of places. That's really where we are right now. A lot of Russians are very angry over this. So I guess the answer is Orban is correct. If I were a European, I would get together with my coalition of the willing, if you will, and I would say, we got to put together a proposal for Moscow. Let's send them a proposal. Let's study what they've already said. They're talking about a new security architecture. Okay, let's look at it. Then we'll put our proposal together and we'll go to Moscow and meet with President Putin. And I think that would work. They could do it. That's Zelensky's nightmare, that could happen, because that's when he is absolutely finished. That's when he gets into his private jet, flies to Italy, or flies over to Florida and settles down into his $15 million estate south of Naples.
There's another report that came out that kind of contradicts the U.S. increasing support for Ukraine. So Pentagon officials told European leaders in August that the U.S. plans to cut back military aid to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They warned Europe needs to rely less on America, since Trump wants the U.S. military focus more on homeland defense. So we've got that report, but we've also got the report of Trump telling, I think it was Lithuania's leader, to shoot down, or Estonia's leader, to shoot down any Russian jets, giving them authority to shoot them down. But later on, when asked whether the U.S. would get involved if that happens, he said, depends on a case-by-case basis. Rubio walked down those comments. What do you make of all this?
The last time that I spoke privately and personally with President Trump, when I was in the administration in November, December of 2020, and before that in April of 2020, when I first met him, he made it very clear to me that he wanted to dramatically reduce European dependence upon the United States. There's no question about it militarily. And we exchanged views. And the idea was, he said, frankly, Doug, what do you think happens? Are the Germans ever going to increase their investment in defense? And I said, yes, sir, when we leave. And he knows that. Nothing fundamentally is going to change in Europe until we get out of it. And that's not just in military terms, that's in political terms as well. Our presence, our influence in Europe right now is a crutch that enables the Europeans to avoid doing the things that they need to do. And one of the things they absolutely need to do is get along with Russia. Stop pretending the Russians are going to invade. They're not interested in invading. It's over.
It could. We've seen China fill that void as the US is pulling out, especially with the alienation of the Gulf countries. China's increasingly filling that void in the Gulf nations. Could we see China fill that void that the US is leaving in Europe and the alienation of European allies? I know it's a stretch.
You mean militarily?
Militarily, yeah.
No. I think what the Chinese are doing, which is extremely important right now, is that they have concluded accurately that the dollar is failing. If the dollar is failing, what do you do with all the treasury bonds that you purchase from the United States? You begin to dump them. They've been reducing their vulnerability to the dollar's weakness for months, from over 1 billion down to about 750 million, and I think it's continuing to drop. What they're doing instead is that they're opening gold vaults, one in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, one that will be in Hong Kong. These are beyond the Shanghai Gold Exchange. These vaults are going to contain great quantities of gold for gold-backed transactions. Now, what are these gold-backed transactions designed to replace? They're going to replace the petrodollar. This is so when China ships whatever goods it does, military or otherwise, to Saudi Arabia can pay in gold. If the Chinese buy oil and gas from Saudi Arabia, the Chinese can pay for it in gold. These are literally warehouses with gold in them. And you move the gold from point A to point B as it changes hands. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can still trade in yuan. And right now, Saudi Arabia and China are trading in yuan because the yuan is de facto backed by gold. So the lesson is fiat currency can be diluted. Fiat currency, the United States dollar, is being debased by our country. We are debasing it because we don't want to restructure the debt. In other words, we don't want to go through default. So we're debasing the currency. This isn't going to work because the rest of the world now treats the dollar as poison. The problem for the Chinese and BRICS in general is that their banking system is not as fully developed and sophisticated as ours. But they are conducting transactions across international lines in their respective currencies. That's going to grow more and more in the near future. Fewer and fewer people are going to use the dollar. That handwriting is on the wall.
Yeah, I think you've put that as well in your post that for the first time ever, and just before I continue, quick correction, I think what you meant earlier is from $1 trillion to 750 billion in terms of US treasuries by China, not a billion. But you did talk about how for the first time ever, as a reserve asset, gold has overtaken the US dollar. I think this is a silent threat to the US that no one's talking about as the US continues to overextend itself. But what looks worse, kind of as we slowly wrap up, what looks worse than what's happening in Europe for the US is what's happening in the Middle East. We've seen that defense pact between Saudi and Pakistan. Saudi's hedging their bets. We've seen China in talks with those Gulf nations to supply even more weaponry. How far do you think Israel will go with American support? And do you think they will continue alienating those Gulf nations, or do you think the US will be able to perform some damage control after the strikes on Qatar?
Yeah, I think the damage control is going to be tough. I think this Abraham Accords is dead on arrival. So I think we're in a new era. So I think what the Chinese are doing is enabling the coalescence of Muslim nations into an alliance that can respond to Israel. I think you're going to see Chinese strike weapons, missiles, radars, and so forth, the most recent, technologically advanced available, show up in places like Egypt. Not just in Egypt, probably in the Emirates, I fully expect something similar will happen with the Turks. All of these nations have had it with us. You know, the problem we face, and we don't understand this, I know that President Trump doesn't. What's happening between Israel and the rest of the Muslim world is as follows. There will be no two-state solution anymore. That may have been possible at one point, but it will not exist in the future. So you get one of two outcomes. Either there is no Palestinian state, there is only an Israeli state, or you get a Palestinian state and there will be no more Israeli state. In other words, this is a fight to the finish. This is a battle of annihilation now, and the region is arming itself for that outcome. China is enabling that in its own way. Now, the Russians are also interested in this because they are heavily invested in Iran and its role in BRICS and its role in commerce and military cooperation and everything else with Russia. So Russia is also involved, but China has taken the lead on this thing from an economic and a military assistance standpoint. We are probably not noticing, or we're not accepting this reality. Because if we did, we'd turn to the Israelis and say, it's time to stop. But since the Israelis control us and we don't control them, and Mr. Netanyahu controls Trump, Trump doesn't control Mr. Netanyahu, that's very unlikely to happen. So what I see instead is a resumption of the war between Netanyahu, Israel, and Iran. And that will probably spread across the region. This time around, it will not simply be Iran.
That's a pretty bleak way to end it, Colonel.
Well, you asked the question, Mario. What am I supposed to do?
Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you again, sir. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Right.
Have a good day, sir. Bye-bye.